Hello and welcome to Two Guys One Game. The GameCube is a strange one when it comes to fighting games. On one hand, it's not really known for having many on the system, but on the other hand, it has what is arguably some of the best fighting games ever made. And in this video, we're going to take a look at some of the fighters that it does have to offer. But anyway, how about I stop acting like I know what I'm talking about and shut the hell up so we can look at some games. First up is Bloody Roar, which is the second game I got for my GameCube, and boy was I glad I did. The Bloody Roar series sees you select from a decent roster of characters, each of which have their own unique fighting styles as you'd expect, but on top of this, all the characters have an alternate animal form which drastically changes their fighting style. While in animal form, your character's speed, power and defense increases. You can only stay transformed for a short time though, so make the most of it. But don't worry, punching people in the face means that you can stay as your furry for longer. The graphics here are really good, especially for an early GameCube game. All the characters have loads of smooth animation and the detail is impressive. The arenas you fight in are also very varied. They're relatively large 3D arenas, and most of them have a few levels you can smash your opponent through to access new areas, or you can sometimes just win via ring out. But the important thing with fighting games are the controls, and thankfully the controls here, they're great. Everything flows very smoothly and the special moves are easy to pull off using Street Fighter style inputs. Each character has a pretty wide range of attacks and special moves, and there's even super moves that deal massive damage. Of course, you're likely to find your favourite character rather quickly, as each one does play quite differently. Some definitely take more time to learn than others. This is also a great game for beginners though, as button mashing can work with certain characters, though like in most games like this, it won't do much good against someone who knows how to play, which, as you can tell by the footage, definitely isn't me. The only slight downside really I think for this game is probably its lack of content. There's only one character to unlock, which you do by beating the arcade mode, and speaking of modes, there aren't that many, just your standard arcade, survival and multiplayer. But what is here though is really solid fighting game, and it does well to stand out from other fighters even now. It's a blast to play in single or multiplayer mode, and is one you'll find yourself coming back to quite often, even if it is just for a few rounds. It's a shame that Bloody Roar series hasn't had a new release since 2004, as it's definitely worth your attention. There was a distinct lack of Street Fighter games on Nintendo consoles after the Super Nintendo, but Capcom did make an appearance on the GameCube with Capcom vs SNK 2, and boy, it is good, even if it is a little shallow. It uses the great detailed pixel art style, which is usually my favourite for fighting games, and as you've probably guessed, it mixes characters from various Capcom and SNK franchises. This means that you've got an amazing roster of characters with dozens of fighting styles. They all look really good and the animation is silky smooth. The backgrounds here are all in 3D and have a fair bit going on. They're generally good to check out as there are lots of references to the games as well as other characters from the games that didn't quite make it as playable characters. I've never really played the SNK fighting games and their fighters definitely did feel different to use compared to Street Fighter ones. There's also a whole load of options when it comes to super move and gauges. These are all taken from the various games. As I'm a basic bitch, I stuck with the standard build a meter to do super moves one. But those of you that have played games other than Street Fighter Alpha will likely find there's a better one that suits your play style, as there are 6 distinct styles to choose from. Something to watch out for here though are the controls. There's 2 main modes, GC mode and AC mode. GC mode is GameCube mode, which is made for beginners. On this mode you have 1 punch button and 1 kick button, and all of your special moves are mapped to different directions on the C-stick. For some reason this is the default setting, and really confused me when I started playing. AC mode though is your classic 6 button setup, though the default controls have the L and R buttons mapped the wrong way round, at least compared to the SNES controller. Thankfully you can remap the entire button layout, so it's worth doing this before you start playing. Once I had done all that though, I really had a blast playing this here. Just seeing the huge variety of characters coupled with the awesome graphics and animation was fantastic. Similar to Bloody Roar, Capcom vs SNK 2 could have done with a few more game modes. You've got your standard arcade mode which focuses on 3-on-3 battles, and you also have 1-on-1 tournament as well as the usual multiplayer options. The arcade mode doesn't have that many stages, and there's only a couple of hidden characters here to unlock too. Having said that though, I did find myself wanting to go right back into the tournament to try out all the different characters. If you're looking for a fighting game on the GameCube, I'd say this is a must-have, especially if you're a fan of Street Fighter or the SNK series. Oh, and it also lets you play out everyone's fantasy match between the two hottest women in fighting, Mai and Chun-Li. Oh yeah. Next up is Battle Arena D.O.N. that was only released in Japan. The D.O.N. stands for Dragon Ball, One Piece and Naruto. This is a crossover game that's clearly influenced by the Smash Brothers games. You have a pretty decent selection of fighters from each of the franchises, with Dragon Ball having a noticeably larger presence, which is fine with me as it's the only one I really care about out of these three. Come at me. The actual fighting here is a simplified Smash Brothers, with just a couple of attack buttons, and depending on the direction you're pressing, you do something different. Of course, each character has their own special attacks, as well as an ultimate attack, all of which are familiar to that character. These are all actually pretty cool to do, but unfortunately the controls here are just very stiff and slow, and they make the whole experience very clunky and imprecise. Couple that with some often brain-dead AI, and the game ends up being just not actually that much fun to play. It's a shame, as the game looks really good with some great character models and backgrounds that really match the shows they're based on. Also, the gameplay mixes things up by giving you objectives to complete during your fights. Unfortunately, these objectives are all written in Japanese, so I had no idea what I was meant to be doing. Thankfully, failing an objective doesn't mean you lose the match. I'm assuming there's bonuses and coins you get for completing them. Obviously, it's not the game's fault that I don't speak Japanese, and I do really like the fact they added things in to help keep it fresh. But, like I said, the controls here really bring the whole thing down, and it does feel like a cheap knockoff rather than the fast-paced action brawler that it should be. As mentioned, the levels are quite varied and they often have hazards in them, but avoiding these can be very tricky thanks to the dodgy jumping and the fact that every animation has to finish before you can start doing something else. There's an impressive 8 characters here that you can unlock, first by beating them in single player mode, and then they're available in the slot machine that you'll need to earn coins for. Again, most of these characters are Dragon Ball, but it's nice to have plenty of things to unlock in a game like this. However, as I said, the gameplay really just isn't up to scratch, and I found that I was punching air more than I was opponents. I didn't get a chance to try this one out in multiplayer, but to be honest, I don't think it would be that much fun, as you just have 4 people hitting the air instead of 1. And playing with the AI isn't really all that much better, as even some of the tougher difficulties they just stood around perfectly still waiting for me to punch them. I wouldn't worry too much about adding this one to your collection. If you want a good anime fighter, stick to the Budokai games. There were 2 Mortal Kombat games on the GameCube, and this one here is Mortal Kombat Deception. Now, I'll be honest, I've always been a Street Fighter guy and never really thought Mortal Kombat was really all that good, so maybe take everything I say here with a pinch of salt. There is a convoluted story here about deception and people being bastards, as you'd expect, and you get to see some pretty cool cinematics that set everything up, but let's be honest, no one actually cares about the story in fighting games, it's all about the punch kicking. And thankfully, there's a hell of a lot of that in Mortal Kombat Deception. As always with Mortal Kombat games, you get a decent roster of characters. There's a few familiar faces in here, and I don't know if it's just because this is the first Mortal Kombat game I've really played since the third one on the SNES, but there was a load of new characters that looked pretty boring and generic that I just didn't recognise or even care about. Boring characters aside though, the gameplay was quite enjoyable, and everything looks really cool. Even though I'm not a massive fan of the games, the style is almost always great. Each character here has loads of animation and plenty of moves and combos to memorise. I don't know if it's just me though, or if it's the GameCube controller, which by the way is usually my favourite controller of all time, but I really had trouble pulling off a lot of the moves here, which was a shame. Now I will hold my hands up and say it's very likely that this is a me problem, but I did find the fighting to be quite stiff no matter who I played as, and often when I would try and jump, my character would instead just walk around the arena, which is annoying, as up acts as jump and also dodge. Nothing seemed to flow here quite as well as it did in games like Bloody Raw and the upcoming Soul Calibur. Sorry, spoiler alert. Again, this might just be that I'm not familiar with the Mortal Kombat mechanics. I did manage to get to the final boss a few times though, but he just absolutely annihilated me every single time. That's alright though, he's the final boss, that's kind of his job. I did find that I wanted to go back and try again though, and I have a feeling with a bit more practice and after getting used to the mechanics a bit more, this would be a lot of fun. It's definitely not a bad game, and it's not as cheap as the ones on the Super Nintendo, and each character has 3 fighting styles that you can switch between on the fly, including a weapon, so there's plenty of stuff to learn here. Something Mortal Kombat never skimps on though is the content, with a K of course. Here there are loads of characters, with a K, to unlock, as well as some really cool game modes. You have the usual tournament modes, but you also have Puzzle Combat, which is a block breaking game where you match colours with Mortal Kombat symbols and you see chibi versions of the characters fighting, depending on how well you're doing. This mode even has its own unlockable characters, which is really cool. Then you have Chess Combat, which is chess, but with Mortal Kombat characters, and it's so much fun. You choose your characters from the roster and you select which one represents which chess piece. Then you play using a slightly modified chess rules. The best part though is that when you go to take a piece, instead of just taking them right away, you have to fight one round, and the winner of that round takes the other piece. It makes everything very tactical as you want to make sure you use your best characters to play with. I ended up playing this mode way more than I expected, and even though I never managed to win, I had a blast trying. Even though I will always prefer Capcom fighting games, I really did actually enjoy this. The controls and fighting are pretty stiff, but like I say, I'm not sure if that's the game or just me not being used to it. But I will definitely be going back to this one to give it a try, even if it is just for a few games of chess. Dream Mix TV World Fighters is the stupidly named fighting game that takes more of a leaf out of the Smash Brothers book, as it pits characters from Konami, Hudson, as well as the Takara toy range against each other. This means you have Simon Belmont taking on Master Higgins from Adventure Island, and freaking Optimus Prime. There's also characters from Bloody Roar, Beyblade, Bomberman, and even Solid Snake. It's a very varied lineup. As you'd expect, the gameplay is very similar to that certain Mario fighting game that I'm trying not to go on about, with a main attack button, a special button and a jump button. Pressing the different direction while you attack means you do different attacks. Though, similarly to Battle Arena D.O.N, the controls here are just too stiff and clunky, and it can make combat feel quite frustrating. It still works fine, but considering the potential, it's a real disappointment. As you fight, you'll collect heart tokens. You'll want as many of these as you can get, as you'll lose a match if you don't have enough. But you also need to make sure you're punching as many people in the face as possible, as everyone does kind of share a health bar. I did find here that the opponents did get quite challenging, and you definitely can't just run in all guns blazing. As you'd expect, there's plenty of stages all based on the games that the characters are from, or should I say what franchise they're from, as they're not all specifically gaming characters. These are all cool, and of course they come with their own hazards and things to get in your way that can distract you. I really did enjoy seeing what was going to show up next. Something definitely worth a mention here are the cutscenes, which are all in Japanese, but I did find that I never skipped them, as you can still kind of tell what's going on, and they are often really funny. The sense of humour in this game is great, and very Japanese. While this is definitely never going to be played over something like Smash Brothers, it's a little too basic in terms of gameplay, but it can be fun with a few friends if you want a bit of a mindless mashup. And finally for today, we have Soul Calibur II. Now, if you own a GameCube and like fighting games, I'm going to assume you already know way more than I ever will about this game, as it's one of the best on the system. It's a weapons-based fighter that looks and plays incredibly. You have more than 20 characters to choose from, each of which plays very differently from one another. Of course, famously, each console version of the game got its own unique character, and the GameCube got Link, who fits in really well and is very fun to play as. But make sure when you do play this game, you do try out the other characters too, as they are all fun to play as and good to learn. As you can see, the game looks fantastic. The graphics here are some of the best on the system, and everything is just silky smooth and controls really well. The combat here is fluid, and learning the combos is really satisfying. I found that even as soon as I started playing, everything felt intuitive, and the amount of animation in the way it flows really works. It's the kind of combat I was hoping for from the earlier Mortal Kombat game, if I'm honest. You fight in some large 3D arenas, and as is normal with games like this, you can knock your opponents out of the ring and win a round, if you don't deplete their life bar, that is. There's a few game modes here, and the weapon mode is really fun addition, where you move around a map fighting and building up your weapon collection. While it still basically boils down to one-on-one fights, it does add a bit more purpose to the game, and it's a good place to get all those unlockables. There's a lot of nice little touches in the game as well, which are really nice. Like at the start of each fight, you get a flyover view while the announcer tells you a bit about your opponent and why they're fighting. It's a nice little touch, and it gives a bit more levity to the battles, which can get surprisingly epic. While I am by no means a particularly good Soul Calibur player, This has always been a favourite game of mine for the GameCube. I was blown away when it was first released, and I'm happy to say it still plays better than a lot of modern fighting games. This is a must-have for any GameCube owner, whether you're a fighting fan or not. So there you go, 6 fighting games released on the best ever Purple Cube. What are your favourite fighting games for the GameCube? Let us know in the comments below, and we'll be sure to include them when we do the inevitable part 2 of this topic. Don't forget to subscribe, we've got loads of cool videos for you to check out, and we upload more when we make them. And why not follow me on Instagram, where I've got hundreds of modern and retro video game reviews. Now, all that's left for me to say is thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.